Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, March 7th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The U.S. approved 100 arms deals for Israel since October 7th. So the Washington Post reported on Wednesday that the Biden administration has secretly approved more than 100 separate foreign military sales to Israel since October 7th to support the mass killing of Palestinians in Gaza. And we don't know how these sales are being funded. The U.S. does provide Israel with $3.8 billion in military aid each year, and $3.3 billion of that is what they call foreign military financing, and that is money that the U.S. gives to foreign governments to purchase American weapons. So, again, there's been over 100 sales here, and only 2 have been made public. One for $106 million in tank ammunition, and one for $147 million in components needed to make 155 millimeter artillery rounds. And these became public because the Biden administration bypassed Congress to push them through. If you remember, I covered both of those deals. And U.S. officials told the Washington Post that there was no public debate for the other 100 deals because the dollar value fell under the threshold needed to inform Congress. So it looks like they are doing a bunch of these little arms sales, so there's no oversight, so it doesn't need to be made public, so they can just do it quietly and secretly. Something I've been saying for a while is discussing how the U.S. has not been transparent at all about what they're sending Israel, about how this is being paid for. But yet they're shipping all these weapons. The Pentagon was saying at one point they were shipping weapons on a near daily basis to Israel. And this explains some of it, I think, that they're doing just these little sales that they could probably do quickly just to keep it out of the public eye, as Biden is coming under pressure for supporting this genocidal campaign in Gaza. And the report said that U.S. officials told Congress during a classified briefing that the hundreds of sales amounted to thousands of precision-guided munitions, small diameter bombs, bunker busters, small arms, and other types of lethal aid, what they call lethal aid, which means aid that can kill people. So the exact number of bombs and other types of equipment that the U.S. has delivered to Israel since October 7th is not clear. The Wall Street Journal reported on December 1st that the U.S. had provided Israel with 57,000 artillery shells and 15,000 bombs, including massive bunker busters, but that figure must be much higher at this point since that was published over 3 months ago. And this revelation about these 100 arms sales that the U.S. has approved for Israel, it comes as the Biden administration claims that it's pressuring Israel to allow more aid into Gaza, where children are starving to death and a major famine is imminent if it's not happening already. But the U.S. is not using its leverage over Israel. They're not threatening to cut off military aid. They're still providing this unconditional aid. So this just goes to show, you see these U.S. officials saying one thing, and they're also getting cover in the media. We see these reports about how frustrated that Biden is with Netanyahu. After Gantz visited Washington, there was these reports saying that, oh man, the U.S. officials really held his feet to the fire about what's happening in Gaza. But it's clear that they're not really, because they're still providing all these weapons. And on top of the, again, not exactly sure how these sales are being paid for. Israel has money. They can buy weapons, but the U.S. does give them a lot of military aid. And they're trying to give them another $14 billion, and that's part of that massive foreign military aid bill that passed through the Senate, but it still hasn't gone through the House. All right, so the next one here, newborns die of hunger as Israel condemns Gazans to starvation. So this is a pretty rough story. This is from CNN, actually. And this is based on there was a segment on CNN about a hospital in Gaza showing children starving to death. They actually showed a woman, a mother, standing and crying over a 3-year-old girl that had just starved to death, and then they show her body. They also show the 10-year-old who recently starved to death of cerebral palsy. I've seen pictures of him, but the way his face is sunken in, I mean, it really does look like something from the Holocaust. And they showed a video of him. And they show videos of these babies with their bony legs, sticking out of their diapers. But it's just, I mean, it's so horrific. So I'll just read a little bit of this story from CNN. It's surprising to see this. CNN has they've had their employees have come out against their biased coverage of what's happening in Gaza. So this could be the result of that, to have this. I mean, there's nothing in here redeeming for Israel at all. So the story says, Anwar Abdul Nabi perches on the edge of a bed at the Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza. Her eyes are sunken with grief. The young mother tenderly holds to the fingers of her daughter, Mila. Just minutes ago, the 3-year-old girl died of starvation. She said, quote, "My daughter was taken into God's mercy because of the lack of calcium, potassium, and oxygen. Suddenly, everything dropped because she was not eating anything with iron or eggs. She used to eat eggs every day before the war. Now nothing. She passed away," end quote. As Israel's severe restrictions on aid entering the Gaza Strip drain essential supplies, displaced Palestinians told CNN they are struggling to feed their children. Starving mothers are unable to produce enough milk to breastfeed their babies. Doctors say parents arrive at overwhelmed health facilities begging for infant formula. In northern Gaza, people rush to grab aid from infrequent humanitarian drops. Health workers say they cannot offer life-saving treatment to malnourished Gazans because Israel's bombardment and siege has crushed the medical system. So the Ministry of Health in Gaza said Tuesday that since the beginning of the war, 364 health workers had been killed. So that's a lot. Over 364 health workers. The current death toll is 3,717, and that's an unlikely, I mean, it must be an undercount because it doesn't account for the thousands of people missing and trapped under the rubble. So this story just goes more into the horrific scenes in these Gaza hospitals. And now at least 20 Palestinians have starved to death recently. 18 of them are children, I believe. I know one was an elderly man. I believe the other was another elderly person. And it's horrific. And, I mentioned that picture of that 10-year-old with cerebral palsy reminded me of the Holocaust, but also reminded me of Yemen. I mean, this was the situation parents were facing in Yemen under the U.S.-backed Saudi blockade and bombing campaign for many years, and things have only just gotten a little better there since the ceasefire in 2022, and now there's this new war. But Yemen just got such little attention compared to Gaza. But I'm sure many of you have seen the images of the starving children in Yemen. Just so horrific. And the U.S. government is supporting this again in Gaza. All right. So the next one here, the UN experts condemn Israel for the aid convoy massacre. And that's another thing the CNN article gets into, the Flower Massacre, and the fact that several times since then, Palestinians have come under attack while waiting for aid or trying to get aid from trucks. So this article is from Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute, and it says special rapporteurs with the United States have rebuked Israel after its forces opened fire on hundreds of Palestinians gathered around aid trucks in the Gaza Strip, killing at least 112 people and injuring nearly 800 more. In a press release issued on Tuesday, a group of 7 UN experts accused Israel of wielding food as a weapon against Gaza's population of 2.3 million, saying that it was intentionally starving the Palestinian people. They added that IDF troops were now targeting civilians seeking humanitarian aid, citing the February 29th Flower Massacre in Gaza City. The experts said, quote, "The attack came after Israel has denied humanitarian aid into Gaza City and northern Gaza for more than a month. Israel must end its campaign of starvation and targeting of civilians," end quote. And Will just goes over the situation that happened. That was last Thursday. which is now known as the Flower Massacre, which killed 112 Palestinians and injured over 700. So it was a huge massacre there. And Israel tried to blame it all on a stampede, but that has been, the doctors that treated the patients said about 80% of them suffered gunshot wounds, 80%. All right, so the next one here, Trump on the Gaza slaughter, he says, finish the problem. So former President Donald Trump, who is, now that Nikki Haley's dropped out, I guess maybe it's not official yet, but he is going to be the GOP candidate for 2024. And he said in an interview with Fox and Friends on Tuesday that he supports Israel's military operations in Gaza. And so I haven't seen him talk about this much. All I've seen is him saying, this would have never happened if I was still president. And he says that a lot about Ukraine. He doesn't really say much about what he's going to do. Everything is kind of just about, what could have been if he was president. So when he was asked this question by one of the Fox and Friends hosts, who the way that they framed it was, Biden's abandoning Israel. You're not going to abandon Israel, right? And one host said, because you're firmly in Israel's camp on this, right? Like talking about Gaza. And Trump said, yeah. And then the host asked Trump if he was on board with the way the Israeli military was carrying out its campaign. And Trump replied, quote, you've got to finish the problem. You had a horrible invasion that took place. That would never have happened if I was president, by the way, end quote. And that's basically all he said, again, about what's actually happening, instead of everything else was just about, if I was president, it wouldn't happen. But I think it's clear that based on his record when he was president, that he's going to give Israel everything that it wants. He did not elaborate on his position at all. And then he was asked whether or not he would support a ceasefire. He basically was asked, would you support a ceasefire? Is that totally out of the realm of possibilities? And he dodged the question, basically. He said, quote, look, I hate seeing what's happening. Again, it would have never happened. This attack on Israel, and likewise Israel's counterattack, which is what it is, would have never happened if I was president, end quote. So he just keeps going back to that. And I just put a few examples here of how pro-Israel he was as a president. He carried out several policies to support Israel's claims to occupied land, big moves, including recognizing the Golan Heights, which Israel annexed from Syria. He recognized that as Israeli territory. He declared that his administration declared that illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank do not violate international law. His administration also moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And he unveiled, I don't know if a lot of you remember this, but Trump put out this peace plan that was basically made up by Jared Kushner that he called the deal of the century. And this peace plan for the Israelis and the Palestinians was just a nightmare. If you look at the map here, I linked to a piece from Jonathan Cook about when this came out. This was in 2020, January 2020. And you see the map of what would become Israeli and Palestinian territory. It's basically Israel would have annexed a huge swath of the West Bank, the Jordan Valley, all of its settlements, and there would have been Israeli-only access roads. It was just a complete non-starter of a peace deal, and of course it was rejected by the Palestinians right away. And at the time when it came out, Netanyahu was saying, I like it, I'm going to annex these areas, I'm going to do it, but he never actually went ahead with it. But just again, with Trump, this is one thing. With Biden, he's so pro-Israel and so supportive of this slaughter in Gaza. Trump is probably going to be as well. And, depending on who he puts in his administration, all this concern about humanitarian aid that we see, or the phone, they act like they're concerned, at least in the Biden administration, and they do these aid drops. We might not even see that with the Trump administration. But there's a lot of ifs there. Who knows who he's going to surround himself with? And a lot could change between now and November. It could be a completely different situation. All right, so the next one here, U.S. cable warns that an invasion of Rafah would have catastrophic consequences. So this is from The Intercept, and it says that a leaked U.S. cable sent by the U.S. Embassy in Israel basically is predicting that the attack on Rafah is going to be a complete disaster. So a diplomatic cable sent Monday from the U.S. Embassy in Israel offers an unusually candid assessment of the humanitarian situation in Rafah, a southern city in the Palestinian Gaza Strip that borders Egypt. The cable, written by officials with the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance at the U.S. Agency for International Development, warns about the potential effects of an all-out Israeli ground invasion of Rafah, where about 1.5 million Palestinians driven south by Israeli evacuation orders are sheltering from Israel's war on Gaza. The cable says, quote, a potential escalation of military operations within southern Gaza's Rafah governorate could result in catastrophic humanitarian consequences, including mass civilian casualties, extensive population displacement, and the collapse of the existing humanitarian response. Multiple relief actors have warned USAID's Levant Disaster Assistance Response Team. An offensive in Rafah would likely block the entry and transport of fuel and life-saving humanitarian assistance through the enclave, rendering critical infrastructure inoperable and leaving people in Gaza without food, medicine, shelter, and water, end quote. And Rafah, that's the border crossing from Egypt. That's where that is. So I think they're saying that the full invasion could block all the aid shipments altogether. So the U.S. is completely aware of what a disaster this would be, how many civilians would be killed, yet they're not offering any sort of consequences for Israel if they go ahead with it. And Ramadan is coming up quick. I haven't written up anything about the hostage deal talks in a couple days because it's been kind of, there hasn't been much coming out really on it, but they're still going on in some form. And Ramadan is soon, and that's when Gantz threatened that they would invade by Ramadan if there is no deal. All right, so the next one here, the first casualties in Houthi attacks on shipping. So the U.S. military said on Wednesday that a Houthi attack on a cargo ship killed 3 crew members and wounded 4, marking the first casualties in the Houthi operations against commercial shipping that were launched in response to the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. So U.S. Central Command said that a Houthi ballistic missile hit the motor vessel True Confidence, which is a Barbados-flagged, Liberian-owned bulk carrier. The Houthis took credit for the attack. They said that the ship was American-owned, but there was a statement from the ship's owner, which is True Confidence Shipping, which is based in Liberia, and the management company is Greek. The owner said that there's no current connection with any U.S. entity. The way ships work, contracts change a lot. Operators change a lot. So maybe at one time recently there was a connection there, but right now they're saying that there's not. Houthi military spokesman Yahya Sarria said Yemeni forces, quote, struck the U.S. ship in the Gulf of Aden, which caused a fire to break out, end quote. And he said that the operation was carried out after the crew rejected warning messages from Yemeni naval forces. In response to the reports of civilians being killed, Houthi officials said that they don't intentionally target crew members. So Mohammed al-Bukaidi, a member of Ansar Allah's political bureau, which is the official name for the Houthis, the Ansar Allah, he said, quote, we do not intentionally harm the crews of ships belonging to enemy countries, so we ask them to return and warn them not to cross. America and Britain's insistence on the continuation of genocide in Gaza, the starvation of its population, and its aggression against Yemen is what led to this dangerous escalation, end quote. So later on Wednesday, Yemeni media reported that the U.S. and British airstrikes were hitting Hodeidah, the Red Sea. There's a port city called Hodeidah and also a province called Hodeidah on the Red Sea. They said it hit the airport there. And the new U.S. bombing campaign against the Houthis, we know, has killed at least 1 civilian and wounded 10 others in February. The Yemen Data Project, which tracks airstrikes in Yemen, said that 1 civilian was killed and 7 were injured when the U.S. bombed a telecommunications site in Yemen last month. 2 were wounded in a strike on a pesticide factory, and 1 was injured in a strike on a farm. So these are some of the targets that the U.S. has hit. The U.S. has killed at least 17 Houthi fighters. That's all the Houthis have said. Could be more. And I just mentioned that the U.S. has because if you look at the statements from the U.S., of course, they're saying, the Houthis killed innocent civilians, which, of course, it's a tragedy that innocent merchant sailors have been killed here. But you just see the statements from the U.S. while they're responsible for so many civilian deaths in Gaza and Yemen, the history in Yemen. I mean, between the drone war and the Saudi UAE war, again, a genocidal kind of war that involved the Starvation blockade. The U.S. is just not one to talk. And this new bombing campaign against the Houthis has just totally escalated the situation and is just making everything worse. And that's, it's just a complete mess. And I have a feeling that they're going to use this to escalate even more. I wouldn't be surprised. All right, so the next one here, Russian forces make steady gains in eastern Ukraine. So Russian forces have been making steady gains in eastern Ukraine since taking the strategic Donetsk city of Avdiivka last month as Ukraine's war effort continues to falter. According to Russian Defense Ministry estimates, it took Russian troops 4 months to advance 5.6 miles through Donetsk before taking Avdiivka. In the last 3 weeks, Russian forces have already advanced 3 miles west of the city. And this was expected after they took Avdiivka because it was a very key strategic city for Ukraine, the center of their war effort going back to 2014 when the Donbass war broke out. And they've been able to keep up. The Russians have been able to keep up the momentum. They're also starting to take out Abrams tanks. The U.S. made Abrams tanks. The U.S. has shipped 31 to Ukraine. Russia has said so far they've taken out 3 of those tanks. Despite the bleak situation, we know that Ukrainian soldiers on the front line are facing serious manpower and weapon shortages. It's a horrible situation for them. Ukraine's new ground forces commander, Alexander Pavlyuk, insisted that Ukrainian forces will be able to stabilize the situation and eventually go on a new counteroffensive. But we'll see. I mean, right now it's just looking really bad for the Ukrainian troops on the ground who are fighting. And, of course, the U.S. still wants to fund this thing to the tune of another $61 billion. All right, so the next one here, Putin's draft treaty between Russia and Ukraine did exist. So this article is from Ted Snyder. This is actually one of our viewpoints for today's page. And this is something I've been meaning to write up. I've kind of had it sitting around. And I'll read from Ted's article here. So this is about the peace deal that was on the table back in March 2022 and April 2022 when Russia and Ukraine were involved in negotiations. So on June 13th, 2022, Putin announced that Russia and Ukraine had reached an agreement in Istanbul and that the agreement had been initialed by both sides. On June 17th, Putin held up the draft agreement and showed it to a delegation of African leaders. Representatives from each side of the negotiations have confirmed that a peace was within reach and even that a draft agreement had been arrived at. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov backed Putin's account, saying that everything was initialed. But this is not just a Russian tale. Former advisor to the office of the president of Ukraine, Alexei Arestovich, who is a member of the Ukrainian delegation in Istanbul, says that the negotiations were successful. And a second member of the negotiating team also reports that they were very close to a deal. Turkey said they were close. A former German chancellor who was involved in the negotiations said they were close. But despite all the overwhelming evidence by witnesses, detractors have argued that peace was nowhere close. But on March 1st, so this was what I have been meaning to write up but haven't gotten around to it, the Wall Street Journal revealed that a draft peace treaty did exist. The draft that Putin held up for his audience was not a deception. The Wall Street Journal reports that they and others familiar with the negotiations have viewed it, and the draft agreement they viewed bears a very strong resemblance to the one Putin and the delegates to the talks claimed. The 17-page document viewed by the Journal was dated April 15th, 2022. That date is consistent with the timing of the Istanbul communique that Putin held up. So the big things here was that according to this treaty that the Wall Street Journal saw, Ukraine was free to pursue European Union membership. That was the first stipulation. The second was that Ukraine would not be allowed into NATO. The third was that there would be limits placed on Ukraine's military and the fourth regarded agreements on culture and territory. So a few of the things were not completely worked out, and were basically, one thing was the cap on the number of Ukrainian troops that were allowed. Russia wanted to cap it somewhere around 85,000. Ukraine wanted to cap it around 200,000. They still had to work that out. And the other thing was the fate of the Donbass region. This agreement, Ukraine agreed that Crimea would remain in Russia's hands, and that Zelensky and Putin would hold face-to-face talks to negotiate the Donbass region. And that means that Russia might have been willing to withdraw from there, the territory that they and the separatists controlled at the time. So this is, big. And again, it shows, we've been covering this on antiwar.com, the fact that there was a draft peace treaty on the table, and that the U.S. and the West discouraged it, told them to stop negotiating. Let's fight. We'll give you all this money. And we've gotten so much, crap for it from people, dismissing it. And it's all true. And it's really just shows how damaging the U.S. involvement has been for peace in Ukraine. But go check out Ted's article. It's very good. He's really good at keeping track of all this stuff. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. is using AI to identify targets in the Middle East and Ukraine. So this is from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. A defense official said that U.S. Central Command has deployed an AI program to help identify targets to bomb in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. The U.S. is also using the AI targeting system dubbed Project Maven to locate Russian targets that were destroyed by Ukrainian forces. So this is definitely spooky to me. It says that a senior CENTCOM official speaking with Bloomberg said AI systems helped to identify alleged rocket launchers in Yemen. The outlet described the statement made by Skylar Moore, CENTCOM Chief Technology Officer, as the strongest known confirmation that the U.S. military is using AI to identify enemy targets that were subsequently hit by weapons fire. So they're using AI in war, and we know that Israel is using AI in its operation too, to basically carry out as many strikes as they can. They called it, Israeli media called it, an assassination factory. So it's really kind of dystopian stuff here. And who knows how reliable these systems are to pick out targets. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure that the AI that the Pentagon has is pretty advanced, but you just never know. So the last story here, good news. Texas Republicans vote in favor of the Defend the Guard Act. So on Tuesday, Texas Republican primary voters overwhelmingly supported a proposition in favor of legislation to restrict the deployment of the state's National Guard to combat zones. The proposition stated, quote, the Texas legislature should prohibit the deployment of the Texas National Guard to a foreign conflict unless Congress first formally declares war, end quote. In response, 84% of Texas voters in this Republican primary voted yes, and only 16% voted no. I have the tweet in here from Bring Our Troops Home, which is the organization behind Defend the Guard, because that's what this proposition is based on, is the Defend the Guard legislation that if passed by a state, it would prohibit the state's National Guard from deployment to combat zones that were not without a declaration of war from Congress. And this was over 2 million people that voted in this proposition, and about 1.8 million people voted in favor of it. So this is a really good result. This is something that these guys can use to show all of these legislature, all of the state senators, state representatives, to show them, hey, you see, Republican voters want this. And I would be curious to see how this would have, for some reason, the propositions weren't on the Democratic primary either. I bet, even though this Defend the Guard Act has been overwhelmingly supported by Republican state senators and stuff, and the Democrats have mostly voted against it, I bet if you put it to Democratic voters, pose that question, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think they would probably favor this idea too. So, it's a good sign. And hopefully this gives them more ammunition to get this legislation passed in more places. So that's it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. That one from Ted Snyder about Putin's draft treaty. Please go read that. One by Eric Margolis, Murder in Gaza. One from James Banford, Time is Running Out to Stop the Carnage in Gaza. One from Lori Calhoun, Our Bloody Cultural Psychosis. And one from Daniel Hale, the drone whistleblower. I was punished under the Espionage Act. Why wasn't Biden? So he makes a really good point in that piece. So please go check all of that out. You can always support us by sharing this show. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Like, subscribe, comment, YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble. Follow us on Instagram. It's really looking great over there. Twitter, all that stuff. I'll be back tomorrow. Oh, one thing I want to mention. This weekend is going to be a long weekend. Sunday, I'm going to a little award event for the Pierre Spray Award that I'm getting with Gareth Porter, and then Max Blumenthal's getting the top prize. So that should be really cool to meet those guys. And there's going to be some other people there that'll be great to meet. So that's Sunday night. So that means there'll be no Monday show. I'll remind you tomorrow at the beginning of the show. But anyway, I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.